the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We are Dr. Felix Beecher and Joe McKeating, and we talk to a range of top guests from scientists to industry innovators to philosophers. One of the most profound and revolutionary dreams in medical AI is the prospect of automated selection of treatment. Given the profound limitations of one-size-fits-all medicine, this ambition is truly revolutionary. We could have automated systems that work rapidly, cheaply, and with optimal effectiveness. But one major barrier in the way is that large volumes of data that's high quality and large scale is very difficult to find. Well, one person who is at the cutting edge of this kind of area is Mika Newton, CEO of XCures. So Mika, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on. This is an area I've worked on myself. It's a topic dear to my heart. Welcome to the podcast.
Felix, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Good. So Mika, could you just introduce yourself and XCures?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Mika Newton. I'm the CEO of XCures. I've been working in healthcare and the life sciences for the past 25 plus years. I started pretty early on with an interest in computational science related to what I think of as early discovery. So things like proteomics, genomics, and computational chemistry. So really down in the systems biology and basic biology world. But then transitioned over the last 15 years to try to use healthcare data of various ilks to try and do something useful. Everything from doing kind of economic calculations of cost effectiveness to helping design policy and protocols for medical treatment. Been doing this a long time and very excited about what we're going to be talking about here today.
Fabulous. All right, but could you summarize the key problem that you're working on with XCures?
So at XCures, the problem that we find ourselves focused on most directly is the problem of how do you do something useful with medical records. So medical records, which exist for all of us, document every encounter we've had with the healthcare system, but honestly, they're very unstructured. So they contain structured text, unstructured notes, often images and pictures of things that were thrown in a scanner. But they're very important because they have our entire history in them. So we are working on the problem of how do you make medical records useful?
And why is this such an important problem at all?
So every time you go to see a doctor, I'm sure this has happened, to all of us, right, is you go in and the first thing they often give you in the waiting room is a piece of paper that says, tell us everything that's wrong with you. And they're essentially gathering a medical history. I must have filled in hundreds of these forms over the year. In fact, I'm pretty naughty now. I refuse to fill them in, which causes great consternation to the staff, who I always feel bad for, but I'm not doing it anymore. But the reason that that's done is because if you're going to seek care from a professional, a doctor or a nurse practitioner, or anyone who might be helping you with a medical condition, they need to know your history. They need to know what diseases you may or may not have or have had, what medicines you would be on in case there's a contraindication. Certain medications don't go together, and any comorbidities, risk factors that might influence the care that you're giving. And so all of that information is in your medical records, which are spread out all over the place. And if we could only get that into one place, then they could spend a lot less time reading about you and a lot more time treating you for whatever it is that you're seeking care for that day. So it's really critical.
Okay, now XCures, you're building an AI system to convert raw medical records into what exactly?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of history is going to be helpful here, Felix, on XCures. So we started the company 5.5 years ago, it's almost 6 years ago now, really focused on decision-making for cancer patients, cancer is just an incredibly complex disease. And we found that given some good information, which we curated by hand, we could actually develop some pretty good decision-making tools. And we can talk about those more later. But the hard problem we had was when people came to us, we needed to know enough about them to actually use the tools themselves, right? So how do you get information about someone that's spread out? In cancer patients, it's really typical. They'll go to see oncologists and experts all across the country sometimes, get different opinions and have different treatments at different points in their care journey. And you have to bring all of that together in order to make the decision. And so really what made this so important for us is we actually had to understand these people in a great deal of detail in order to figure out how we might be able to help them. And it's that idea of aggregating, organizing, and structuring the medical record and presenting it in the right semantic context so the patient and the care team can treat the patient appropriately. That became our central focus.
Okay, now some people might be asking themselves, well, it's pretty easy. You can just get somebody who's you don't need an AI system for doing this. You can just type out the medical notes and maybe organize them in some way. You can do it by hand. So could you explain what's wrong with that supposition?
Yeah. So first of all, I think let's think about what's in the actual medical records. Well, let me start with some statistics. So on average, we've done about 200,000 patients like this. On average, we get somewhere between 1,400 and 1,500 records for each patient that are returned to us. And they come from over 30 different provider locations. And an important thing to keep in mind here is every single one of those locations has probably a different implementation of a medical record software application, meaning they all have slightly different field names and slightly different organized screens and are customized for particular doctors or care teams. So nothing that you get across those 1,400 files from the 30 plus locations actually looks the same. So that's number one. It's all mixed up. Number two, it's all delivered all together and is sometimes kind of smeared into each other. Like there's pictures of other records. I'll give you an example of how that happens. If I go from one doctor to another and I bring my medical records with me, I actually ask my doctor to print them out. When I get to the next place, the next doctor or the office, they're going to scan them in, and they're now going to become a picture that sits inside the medical record at the second place that I went to. When I pull all the medical records, I'm going to get the medical records from the first place and the second place. So I'm going to get the medical record structured from the first place, and then it's going to appear again as a picture in the second one. So that it just like this duplication, right, and changing formats happens all across the board. And so you end up with thousands, right, and thousands of pages of disorganized records. It contains structured data, which is actually pretty straightforward. Things like height, weight, name. These are pretty consistent. It contains free-form text. So these are the notes and things that the physicians and doctors, or care team wrote about you, which are just written in whatever text that someone happened to enter into an open field in the system. And then lots of these pictures, right, which occur in PDFs, TIFFs, JPEGs. These are file formats that could appear in that document. And so the way we use AI is, number one, we digitize all of that and then use a machine learning based document classification system to essentially decide this is a lab report, this is a continuity of care document, this is a pathology report, this is a radiology report. So what are the types of documents that are in this? And that's based on having seen, millions and millions of these documents now. That's how the training takes place. And then the second thing that we do is we go through and we use natural language processing to essentially turn the free-form text, right, and the text that was in the images that we've now turned into machine-readable text, and to code it into terms, and then use the logic, right, of those terms to begin to assemble the actual history of the patient. And that's a really important use of the natural language processing, very specific to medicine, not only medicine, but the type of report. So pathologists have a certain language, and oncologists have another language, and primary care doctors have another language. And so you have to understand all of those different languages and have essentially the AI applications to process that into something that's meaningful.
Now, it kind of blows my mind, the complexity of the task. My own research, what I was trying to do was big part of my own research was trying to curate data from different clinical trials, even different branches of the same clinical trial. And that was an absolute headache, reshaping data that already came in a beautifully well-organized format. So the idea of trying to turn this gigantic mess into clean data is just a kind of mind-blowing application of medical AI, right? If I were your algorithm, I would kind of wish I hadn't been born, because the kind of work you're asking it to do is so difficult.
Yeah. It's, by the way, I really appreciate what you were doing, trying to, and in previous lifetimes, I've worked on similar projects, right? You get all this medical research and it's all often just published in the literature, right? And just going to read research articles written by experts, even the same experts on the same topics, you'll find out that they've used completely different words, right, to describe the same thing across two different documents, and you have to bring everything into a common language and ontology. The way we went after this, Felix, is really think of a pipeline or a funnel. So what you want to do is every time you take a step forward, right, you want to clean it up. And we started essentially by doing it all completely by hand. So we had human beings and we received the records and we took what was out of the records, I'm sure like you were doing in your research, and we typed them into electronic data capture, essentially a spreadsheet, right? But a well-documented spreadsheet management database. So in the process of doing that, we then started looking at what are all the routine tasks you go through. Things like, what is this document, which is document classification? Where should it go, and so on. So we've worked through that workflow. And honestly, it took 5,000 patients to even begin to get it to the point where we could then really start to automate it. So that was about the learning set, was about 5,000 patients, think of 1,400 to 1,500 records per patient, and human beings typing it. And then it started to pick up speed. And then we went from 5,000 to almost 200,000 very, very quickly. And now it just continues to iterate and get better.
I mean, also the number 200,000 is phenomenal. Let's talk. We can talk about that more in a few minutes. But let's one thing that obviously patients and doctors and the FDA certainly will be interested in is the question of accuracy. What can you say about the accuracy of your system? How do you even test that?
Yeah. So accuracy is a really great question, and I think I'm glad you asked it. It's rather a nuanced question, right? So there are certain things that are very easy to measure, and there are certain things that are impossible to measure. So things that are actually quite straightforward to measure are areas where you've actually had a human being go through and do the structuring. So some human has read the medical record and typed it into the database. And I was talking about the 5,000 patients we were using for training. So in that case, we actually had people, and often two people, go over the same record and classify and say, this is A, this is B, this is C, D, et cetera, et cetera. Then you can run it through the machine and say, how did the machine do versus the humans? Interestingly, you discover at some point, the humans are all making mistakes. We're humans, we make mistakes. Yeah. So there's mistakes in the humans' work, and then there's mistakes in machine work. And it's actually quite an interesting thing to see who makes more mistakes. That part's easy, but where are the mistakes made and who actually makes them? So you can't test the mistakes. So you have to go back and revalidate that entire process. It works, first of all, very, very well for structured data. And I'll come back to structured data in a second. It works very well for certain types of unstructured freeform notes, and there's some caveats there. And then it works just as well on things like images as it does for unstructured text and notes, given that the image quality is okay. So there's issues with how good is the picture. If you've ever seen a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, that's sometimes problematic. On the structured side, the issue we really run into is, what is the truth? So when you look at someone's medical record across 1,400 records, you'll find actually the same structured field. I'll take something like smoking status or something that is reported in lots of different ways, right? And has different information. Like somebody showed up in the office one day and decided to admit they're a smoker, and then the next visit they decided they they were going to say they've never smoked for whatever reason. They just changed their mind about the answer they were going to give. I don't know why. But which one is the truth and which one is accurate? So we can measure accuracy to what's in a record in a specific document. We can measure accuracy across it, but we can't necessarily know what the truth is outside of the medical record. And we can't say if something, sometimes there are things that are just patently wrong. And like you can look at the record and say, that's just not correct, but it's in the record.
Yeah.
So which one do you choose? That's always a little bit of it.
I guess
now,
sorry.
Yeah, no, just one more quick point. We built LLMs or implemented a large language models to actually analyze elements of the unstructured text. That was really fascinating. It's been really recent for us this year. When they work incredibly well. And when they don't work at all, which is actually quite satisfying, right? You don't have, I always hate the 50-50 answer. So I think there's a lot of optimism that much of this unstructured freeform text, right? There's tools now that we're going to be able to use to go after it much more rapidly.
Now, I suppose there are also very subtle philosophical questions involved here potentially. Like, for example, well, one might be that how do you define what a human would do? Because obviously, if somebody is sitting there with a lot of concentration and working through a medical record very carefully, they may do brilliantly. But on the other hand, if it's like 1:30 a.m. and they're tired and they've got 50 million to get through, then human performance is very dependent on these kind of subtle things, right? And I guess the other paradox is potentially, even on an individual basis, if your system is at a training level not that accurate, it still could generate a system that is more accurate than a human, right?
Yeah. So I think the thing that I've really, and we've thought about since the very beginning, and I think is really the key to this, is transparency and chain of custody. So any piece of information that I look at, right, I should be able to see where it came from and why it was coded to be what it is. So if it's been changed to a standard language and we're changing all the units of something so that they're all the same units, for instance, I still need to be able to immediately go back and look at whatever the original record was in the actual source document itself. And that level of transparency, right, and the custody of that data as it transfers through there. Who made the change, right? Did Mika make the change? Did Felix make the change? Are there any notes that were added at the time about that? That's incredibly important to preserve. There are two areas in which that really plays an important part. Number one, if you're going to make a care decision for someone, you're going to make a medical recommendation, and you as the care provider have any doubt about it, you should verify your information. Like, you need to be able to verify it. And all the physicians we ever talked to said, well, it's great that you've told me what's in here, but I need to be able to go and check. If I think it's fishy, right, or not the right thing, or I don't quite understand it, I need to go look at where it's coming from and be able to get to the original. The other piece of this that's really important is if you want to learn from this. So if you want to actually research to make these systems better, or even do research to improve quality of care or make better decisions, et cetera, you need to make sure you're not training these other models on bad data. Because when you train models on bad data, you make bad models, and those could potentially hurt people or be inappropriate in all sorts of ways.
Okay, so we know what the inputs are to your system. They are very, very messy, horrible, inconsistent data. Now, what comes out of your system? Is it like some beautiful, clean matrix, very large matrix, presumably of data, or is it something else?
It's something in between, and it's always getting better. So and one of the fun things about this project is it's a gift that never stops giving in terms of improvements that you can find. We really have focused on producing two things that we think are important. Number one is a digital database of those medical records. So think of all the medical records in a searchable format, because as I said, that some of them are images, some of them are structured text, unstructured text. They came from lots of different places. So you might say, I want to find the latest pathology report. Show me that, or just show me all the pathology reports, or multiple reports, and who did them, right? And that type, and all of that's a digital records database. And the comparator of what you would get if you didn't get that is you might get a stack of 2,000 pages that you would have to thumb through otherwise. So just digitizing it and making it readable and searchable, look for keywords, et cetera. That's one piece. The second piece is that data from those medical records in a common data model. And I think the easiest way I think of explaining a common data model is every single person, you, I, anytime we walk through the front door of a healthcare facility, one of the tests that's always done is your blood pressure is taken. Blood pressure is basically taken in almost every medical encounter you go to. Neither of us have ever seen our blood pressures longitudinally, meaning in order across all the different places we've been on a single graph. So for the elements that we have very high degree of confidence in, we are now putting those into a single unified data model. And that's pretty extensive, by the way. It's not just blood pressure, it's all sorts of things. We have genomics, right? We often have imaging, interpretation history, and so on and so forth. And the work that I was talking about, the gift that keeps giving, is taking all of that digital data, organizing it, understanding all of the synonyms, the different names for things, the implications of things, and building out the elements of that common data model and making it richer and richer and richer along the way is one piece. And then the other piece is filtering that, because if I just, dump on anybody 1,500 pages worth of pure matrix data, you still have to be able to do something useful with it. And most people actually only want 5 or 10 things or 15. So getting access to the right things is also ongoing.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your commercial model, which I think raises all sorts of really interesting questions. Like, first of all, so you've clearly explained what the output from your systems are. What is it that you actually sell? I'm guessing it's not the entire. I guess it's sections of that, or what is it you're actually selling to customers?
So the tool set are tools for anyone who uses medical records to be able to access, aggregate, organize, and store them. So there's kind of two elements to our customers that are important. Number one, our customers need to be involved in the care and treatment of patients in some way. And there are lots of different entities, organizations across the healthcare spectrum that play some role in helping to treat the patient. But this technology is really designed to support that process as a software product. And then you need to have a care relationship under HIPAA. And generally, most organizations would ask the patient for the right to pull your medical record. All of my doctors ask me, can we pull your medical records? Can we look at them? Most patients, I certainly say, yes, of course, please study my medical records. We provide a platform as a software product to people who meet those criteria, so that all they need to do is enter your first name, last name, date of birth, zip code, right? Maybe sex at birth. And based on that simple information, our system will go and find the medical records at all 30 plus different providers, return them all, organize them, and present them to that care team in the database in the structured model that I just talked about. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes from the time you hit go. And so our business model there is as a software provider to people providing care and services to patients.
I see. Now, I'm guessing that also medical AI developers would love to get hands on large data sets from your systems, right? I mean, do you also sell large data sets to developers?
So we hold all of the source documents and the structured data, which contains, personal health information, the PHI of the patients, in a secure, HIPAA compliant environment. We do also, in relationships, not with everybody, but with a good portion of the people that we work with, have an ability to take that data and anonymize it and de-identify it. And we can use that as a derivative, essentially, to drive research for new AI products, to drive research for new medications, to drive, population health and healthcare process improvement. There's lots of uses, though I'm very excited about the one you brought up, which is, training for AI data sets. But that is a derivative of, think of it as the exhaust, essentially, of the process of helping to care for patients, in the same way that hospitals, right, accumulate data on patients and use it to build new applications and adjust their own treatment protocols and processes.
Okay, well, look, in a couple of minutes, let's come back to this notion of using the data to build machine learning models. But let me ask a couple of other questions before we return to that. So one thing that I forgot, neither of us have mentioned yet, is that your systems are specialized for cancer, I think. Is that right? And if so, why did you focus on cancer particularly?
Yeah. So when we started, our systems were specialized for cancer, and I'll explain that in a second. But I think we learned very quickly that when you specialize your system for cancer, you actually end up having to do all the diseases. So one of the questions in cancer care is always, what are your comorbidities? So what are the other diseases that you have? And it becomes really important to know if someone's being treated for an immune disorder or has some sort of cardiovascular disorder, heart failure, or hypertension, or all of these things affect your cancer care because it is usually very aggressive and you're doing surgery and chemotherapy and targeted therapy, like very intense things. So at this point, we really think of it as kind of disease agnostic. The reason we started in cancer and specialized in cancer is we were trying to solve this problem. We're actually trying to build our own AI clinical decision support. Well, we did build it, tool to make treatment options decisions for cancer patients. And these were advanced metastatic cancer patients. So people who have, bad cancer is the way I think of it. It's, advanced, it's metastatic. They're, facing death essentially and need to try to pick out of a relatively complex set of treatment possibilities. What are the right possible things where no one knows the right answer? There's no study. There's no actual proof that anything is the right thing or another. And that really led us into this field in the first place. So in order to do that, you need to understand all these diseases. You need to understand the genomics of the patient, any sort of genetic mutations they might have, both related to their cancer or even hereditary. You need to know all the drugs that they were on. You needed to know what sort of risk tolerance do they have. There are actually like personal questions about, do you prefer safety versus, maybe this being curative, or you're just trying to live a little longer or try to get a cure. All of this stuff that became part of that activity of developing that AI powered tool set. And that's really what led us into cancer in the first place. I always tell people strategically, if I had to go back 6 years, I'm not sure I would have picked cancer as the place to start for sorting out medical records. I'm kind of glad we did. I'm not sure I would do that again. I would have picked something maybe a little simpler to start with. But that's, yeah.
Now, there may be AI developers out there listening who maybe didn't realize that it's possible to get hold of medical records en masse. Now, could you just talk about that? How is that even possible? People might be surprised because they tend to think of medical records as being absolutely sacrosanct.
Yeah. So medical records, the personal health information in medical records is absolutely sacrosanct. It's our private personal medical record. You can remove elements of the medical record that make it basically or you can de-identify it. Mm-hmm. And actually a lot of work has been done around the fact, and I think there's probably nothing is perfectly de-identified, but you can reduce it down to a level where unless somebody actively tried to re-identify someone, you would never know who it is. Mm-hmm. Who's in that record. And then they can be put together kind of into a large curated database where you've really got all the naming and that stuff. So that's the derivative data that I was talking about before. It's usually a limited data set or a de-identified data set. And we actually get an independent expert determination to say that, yes, this is as de-identified as you can get it. Also, when we provide that data to someone who's a researcher or an AI developer or anyone like that, part of the contractual agreements that are involved in that is that under no circumstances whatsoever will that entity try to identify, or reverse engineer any of the pieces of the data itself. So that's inherent in that trust. And then obviously we're very careful and cautious about who and why we would have a relationship with anyone like that. We have to be discriminating.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of commercial questions. Where are you with commercial deployment and how is it going in general?
So it took us 4.5 years to build this, maybe a little bit longer. I'm going to say I really started working January 2019. We went live with our first full-on, we're going to put it in your hands and not use it for you, because that's one of the big jumping off points for technology. It's good enough. I'm just going to give it to somebody and let them use it and then try to help them with problems, but I'm no longer going to push the buttons for them anymore. That would have been about the third quarter of last year in 2023. Since that third quarter, we've been adding something like 2 to 3 new customers per month, every single month, and have probably a queue of something on the order of 10 to 15 now. So it's going very, very well. That kind of has 2 implications. Number one, we're learning a huge amount, right? Because you can imagine, our software engineers and even ourselves, we can't imagine all the use cases or the problems that customers have. So we have a rapidly growing laundry list of features and improvements that need to be made, going back to my comment, the gift that keeps giving. And then the second piece is we are starting to understand the use cases in a lot more detail related to particular types of episodes of care. So for instance, let's say a telehealth visit for genetic counseling versus a telehealth visit for a primary care, like an urgent care type situation. They're very different. And I think it's teaching us now that there are going to be different flavors of this technology, as you can imagine, over time. We don't know what they all are yet, but that's very important from this commercial perspective.
So could you give us a clear standard kind of use case that illustrates how the product might be used?
Yeah. So I'll just put together this kind of, think of a telehealth encounter, of which there are lots of different telehealth encounters. But essentially, and I think we've all done this, you're getting now onto a Zoom call, a Zoom, Microsoft Team, whatever your company or you are using, FaceTime. You're basically getting a video call with a healthcare professional. That healthcare professional, in all likelihood, does not know and doesn't have an ability to get the medical records from all across. They may get some information, let's say, if you came through like your insurance company's portal or something like that, they might get access to one set of records, but they certainly don't have your 10-year medical history. And the whole point of having that encounter is to have it last for, let's say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. So they don't want to do the entire history questionnaire, and you're not going to sit there on your phone clicking the app. So the use case there is, as you sign on, right, or 10 minutes before you sign on, our system is processing in the background. And that telehealth provider, whoever's going to deliver care to you, is given a summary of the information they care about in the context of what they're going to treat you or talk to you about on that day. And that increases the quality and content of care that's delivered in that encounter.
Okay, now let's switch to what is truly one of the holy grails of medical AI, and that is developing an automated system for selecting or at least recommending a treatment option. Now, I would have thought you are in absolutely a phenomenal position to be able to develop this kind of holy grail system, because you have access to the kind of data that can help deliver it. So could you first of all describe your vision for this kind of area?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's funny because this is the can we replace the doctors with AI question kind of boils down to it. And I just want to be really clear. The answer is no. At least for a long time, it's going to be no. I was at a conference just last week, and we were talking a little bit about this in a group. And a very interesting comment was made about this is AI going to replace the physicians or the care decision-making that's made in our health system? And the answer is no. But the systems and doctors who use AI are going to replace the systems and doctors that don't use AI. So this is going to be the driver, right? Because it just makes people so much more efficient. So you laid out two scenarios in your question. One was, could you pick the right treatment option? And the other scenario was, could you recommend some good treatment options to consider? And I really think the second one philosophically is the direction we should be pushing in. I'll go back to cancer care because that was where we started and where a huge amount of work has been done. The reason it's so important in cancer is the number of variables that describe the individual patient themselves. The unique characteristics of every patient are just incredibly complicated. We all have different genetics, we have different histories, we have different exposures, blah, 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 and live in different places. So there's almost an infinite number of combinations that would describe a patient. And then we have thousands, literally thousands of drugs that are used across the care continuum and procedures and surgeries and so on and so forth for the treatment of cancer. So it's impossible to imagine that a doctor or any human being could hold the combinatorial nature of that problem in their heads. I certainly can't. I actually have never met a physician who has told me that they could. There are specialists in a particular type of cancer. So if you have, a rare skin cancer or brain cancer or some sort of GI cancer, there are specialists you can go to see who probably know the best practices in the most leading cutting edge, treatments because they're the ones who are developing those, right, and driving them forward. But that's a very small number of people, and most people are going to see people who are more generalist oncologists. So trying to get the knowledge of those experts in on those people. So I think the philosophy is, how do you create the tool set that is able to, and this is part we've been working on, we've been talking about, which is how do you know as much as you could possibly know about a patient when they walk through the door in a way that a machine or AI could actually interact with, meaning it has to be hard data, right? Some information as inputs. How do you know what are all the things that you might do to treat them? And that list needs to be kind of exhausted. Your treatment options aren't just the first, the 5 best things you think to mind. There are all the things that are out there. And then how do you match, I always think of this, the patient feature set. So the characteristics that define the patient to the treatment options themselves, the things that are possible. And really importantly, we spend a lot of time thinking about this. And this is actually what I think the AI portion of it is. What is the rationale? What is the reason that you say A and B go together and not A and C or A and D? And how do you learn if that's correct? And sometimes it may be quite counterintuitive to thinking. And so I think there's a huge amount of work to go, and lots of, by the way, really brilliant people and companies working on this AI decision making for different scenarios, to go and figure out what are all the ways that doctors actually think, these rationales that they're using. Because we do that in our head. You say, oh, well, this is going on, and I know that works better than that with people, right? That needs to be built into these systems, and then based on evidence.
So what you're saying goes to the concept of personalized medicine, right? Now, in other words, using all of the data that's available in a way that is combined in the most intelligent and optimal way. Yes. And even specialists don't really do that, right? I mean, they may do that in a rather hit and miss kind of intuitive sort of way, but they certainly don't use all of the data that's available in a systematic way. So I've kind of, what you said, I thought was very smart. And that was that, doctors might be replaced by, or doctors without AI might be replaced with doctors with AI. But I kind of wonder whether could turn out to be somewhat equivalent to a doctor not really being so much of what we think of as a doctor anymore, but more of a kind of technician type of person. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. I think there's a couple elements in this that are important. One of them that I think about with a doctor never not being replaced, at least anytime soon, is actually liability. And I don't say that as in like, just from the legal sense of liability of like, who am I going to sue if it goes wrong? But who is accountable? And it's very hard to make AI, how is my computer accountable for anything?
Yeah.
I'm accountable. I push the buttons. So there has to be an operator in this function. And I like your analogy there. Maybe it's a technician, though I think in this case, it's looking at the output and deciding what the right thing to do is. I'm not sure that's so different from doctors, what they're doing today. I mean, if you go and have an MRI, right, there's a machine, a very, very complicated machine that uses magnets, to polarize the molecules in your body and read the emissions from them. And I'm not a physicist or engineer on this. That's only my understanding. And it builds a 3-dimensional picture out of it, which represents different, like somebody looks at that and interprets it, and then makes a decision based on that, or it gets input, their interpretation of it gets input into something else. So I think this is already happening. The thing that the AI is going to solve is the massive overload. So you talked about precision medicine. I don't think precision medicine is truly going to be possible without these AI applications. There's just too much variation. Yeah. It's too big.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So do you, by the way, I mean, just briefly, do you worry about legal liability when it comes to developing your decision-making tools?
Absolutely, I think is the right answer.
So you have a good lawyer.
I can see my general counsel now looking at me, staring. Your answer is yes, absolutely.
I'm sure they're absolutely brilliant. No doubt at all. So look, one last question on this, though. Potentially, this could be an extremely disruptive technology. And we know, of course, that the pace of AI evolution at the moment is kind of quite staggering. Do you worry at all that this kind of system could develop very, very quickly and could disrupt things, the medical profession, faster than people are just able to cope with?
So personally, I'm a technologist. I don't worry so much about the disruption to the medical system. I worry about, is the disruption actually good disruption or bad? Like, yay for good disruption, boo for bad disruption. What I worry about is some of the ethical questions about things like training data and biases in the training data and the suitability, because the models reflect the data, the training information for them, the suitability of like how generalizable are things, and how do we know if they're generalizable or not, and how do we validate that overall. I don't think we have the regulatory frameworks in place now. In fact, I think healthcare, I just saw it in the news, I can't remember the article, there's like calls for more regulation, right, around the development of AI in healthcare. I think one came from a nurses union actually here in the Bay Area where I live. And then there was another article that was very similar out there. And in that case, I worry not about the regulation, but that the frameworks that we create, because we're going to have to create new frameworks for this regulation, aren't designed to slow us down, but are designed to keep us honest, which is that there's two different directions there that it could go. Yeah. But clearly, we need to be very, very careful here. We also need to know what the comparator is. I often use this argument. I think we've seen this with, the best example I know of technology that's regulated, that's AI, that's in the market, is our self-driving cars, right? Mm-hmm. Arguably, the self-driving cars are safer than the human beings, but when a human being has an accident, we all understand that and have the legal, going back to this liability and who's responsible or not. Yeah. Right? When a car makes an accident itself, like, is the manufacturer responsible? Is the driver who was sitting? We got to figure some of that stuff out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, any large data set is going to have biases, right? And it's impossible for it not to. And actually, if you think about it, it's there are certain respects in which it's very, very difficult to tell even what a bias is. Like, let's just take the the example of race. I mean, do we want an equal representation of every single race, like even Pacific Islanders? It's not really clear what unbiasedness even means in some ways.
Yeah, I get asked about this all the time. Is your data biased? And my answer is always the same. It's as biased as the healthcare system is biased.
Yeah,
and we know it's biased, and we know it's unfair, right, in many ways, and we know there are disparities, and we're trying to address those. But the data in the healthcare system is going to represent the healthcare system as it exists. So, first of all, bias is not always a bad thing. Things, to your point, could be biased in a good way. Like, if I happen to meet the bias criteria, like the thing is better tailored to treat me, then maybe it's more of a usefulness. This is an appropriate tool to use for these types of people in these situations because we know it does well. And then the other way might be, don't use it for these types of people. Even as I'm saying it, I think, oh boy, now we're down the slope of, well, now these other folks, for whatever reason, don't have access to AI, so are we leaving them out? And I don't have an answer here, Felix. It's so complicated. I feel this trying to be a good person, right, and trying to do the right thing and fix it.
All right. Well, look, Mika, it has been a fascinating discussion. I've enjoyed it immensely. And but before we finish, I've got the question I always ask, and that is a kind of test of your the breadth of your knowledge on medical AI. And that is, what is your favorite current example of medical AI that's got nothing to do with your own systems?
Okay, interesting. All right. First of all, there are lots of really cool things going on. I think a lot of the stuff around imaging analysis is going to be really cool because lots of people look at pictures, and it turns out computers are really good at looking at pictures if you train them well, and they can be way more accurate, and they don't get tired at 2 a.m. and make a mistake, and all the things you talked about earlier. So that stuff's cool. Not my total favorite, but very cool. The next one I'm really into are the idea of medical avatars. So these are like digital healthcare people. So think of the routine stuff that a nurse or someone in the staffing office needs to tell you that's basically we're reading the same cue card to you over and over and over again. And that could be a very nicely automated AI that can answer basic questions to you. And that would free up really valuable, highly trained people to go do much more high value tasks. Again, cool, coming. The one that I've really been thinking about, and I think it's got a long way to go, is actually listening to, so taking notes on the healthcare encounter itself. So if you think you're in the room with your doctor, and let's say you bring your family member with you and they're in the exam room with you, and maybe a nurse comes in and out. You're there for 15 minutes, maybe a few minutes beforehand where you're chatting with your family member, then the encounter takes place, and then somebody else comes in. There are groups developing basically software that listens and records and understands what's being said in that encounter so that they can document all of it. Now, all of it needs to go in the medical record, and we spent a lot of time talking about the medical record, how you get it back out, but getting it in the first place and actually capturing everything, because the alternative is the nurse or the doctor leave the room and then they go and type what they remember, but I guarantee you they don't remember everything that was said or didn't catch the subtle thing that mom said, right? That's not true, right, to whatever I said, all of that sort of thing. And I just think we would get so much of a richer picture of what actually took place in those encounters compared to where it was. I just think it would be incredibly valuable. And I think it would reduce error, improve quality, and all the rest of it. But it's got to be really well validated. You don't want to record the ghosts who weren't there, essentially.
That's the kind of thing that could lead to somebody taking out the wrong organ.
Yes. Yeah, don't do this, and it missed the don't because someone dropped something.
That's funny. Okay, look, Mika, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And look, I am full of admiration for the kind of project that you're working on. I think it's immensely important. So very, very best of luck with it.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. Thank you so much for having me on. Wonderful conversation.
Cheers then. Thank you for listening. This has been the Medical AI Podcast. We are Felix Beecher and Joe McKeating. Ping us on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new guests. See you next time.